Hey, I'm James from Smoke North BBQ, and YouTube is full of opinions in terms of which is best. You have people team reverse flow, you have people team direct flow, arguing that that form factor is the best offset or the only true offset to have in your backyard. Well, today we're going to try and cut through the opinions and provide some quantifiable facts to help settle this argument once and for all. Let's get into it. Buying an offset smoker has been one of the most difficult grill categories I've ever purchased. This is because in most cases you can't just pop down to a big box store and get your hands on them. You have to rely on online information, take a leap of faith, hand over your credit card and wait anywhere from a couple weeks or months for it to show up in your backyard. So like many of you, I rely on some of these voices, which led me to believe that the only way to get the proper Texas barbecue experience in the backyard is to go with something like a direct flow offset smoker. But when some of the internet's best channels are now also manufacturing pits of their own, selling them in their direct flow offsets, I can't help but wonder if we are artificially overlooking some of the merits of a reverse flow offset smoker. So today I'm going to add a couple tests. We're going to do some IR camera work to look at the heat signatures of what's actually going on between the multiple form factors, as well as an evaporative cooling test to see if there's any differences in terms of how airflow is moving inside of our smoker, as well as the baffle plate in terms of providing some residual heat that might impact the speed of our cook. And to the best extent possible, let the data finish the puzzle in terms of answering the question which is best versus any potential bias for what I make and sell potentially influencing our decision. Speaking of bias, this by no means is to suggest that anybody is artificially inflating the facts one way or another or lying. I've done many trainings. I've been in the corporate world for over 20 years and had the opportunity to get some great unconscious bias training as a leader of managers and teams. And this is just something that we all face. So this is not to throw shade on any creator, but instead to try and bring some facts to an otherwise opinion rooted argument in terms of which is actually best. So the idea for the test actually came from Jeremy from Mad Scientist Barbecue to do the evaporative cooling. So thanks, Jeremy, if you're checking this out, for the idea of the water pan and the sponge. But we're going to fill up a pan with about 2 pounds of water, measure that out using a food scale, and then let this run at stable temperatures around 270 degrees Fahrenheit, like what I would go for ribs, a pork shoulder, or a brisket. And then we'll take measurements at the end of the water temperature. So this will let us know a little bit about the conductive energy potentially coming from the baffle or not. We'll look at the evaporative cooling in terms of the differences between a direct flow and a reverse flow. And then we'll use the IR camera to understand a little bit more of the, they say when you're looking, you're not cooking, but what's actually going on inside to try and paint a picture of what really is going on inside of your offset smoker to help us make a more informed decision. So to get started, I use some kiln dried grocery store wood and my Grill Blazer grill gun to get a nice hot fire. These pits are 950 pounds of raw steel a piece, and so I want to shoot the temperatures up to about 400 degrees Fahrenheit at first, let that settle back down into cooking fire range at 270 degrees Fahrenheit, and that is when we'll install our water pans with the 2 pounds of water, let that run for 3-4 hours, and then we'll do the infrared testing at the end when these have now been running for 5-6 hours and are fully heat soaked, and there won't be the possibility for differences just based off of a starting fire versus a more realistic cooking fire of what would be going on if you were doing something like a brisket. Okay, I've got our food scale and I'm going to weigh each of these to 2 pounds. Now, why 2 pounds? So interesting, a brisket raw, 71% or so according to US Food Association is water versus down to 56% when that's cooked. And so on an average size brisket, 2 pounds of evaporative cooling is the moisture loss that we can expect to see inside of our brisket. So that's why I'm going to set each of these to 2 pounds. Actually, looks like this one is just over 2 pounds. It was 2.1. So let me take some of that water out. First one's exactly 2. Take you fast forward while I repeat that. And exactly 2. Let's go add those to our smokers. So we're fully heat soaked, running right just a hair below 275. Let's add our pans. I'm going to go for the center on each pit. So this first one up is the Echo reverse flow, running the same temp on our Huron direct flow. again go in the center, and we're also 250 on our Old Country G2. Add that into the center, and I forgot, I'm gonna quickly get some high heat gloves, remove the top rack as I don't have that in the other smokers. Okay, we are 4 hours into our test and we've been running along nice and steady, adding logs every hour or so, and that's maintaining 250 to 270 degrees Fahrenheit in all of our smokers. So I've learned from doing this test before, where I only have 2 hands, that if I remove the pans, take them over to where I've got the food scale and start to measure things, some water will start to cool off quicker than others. So I've grabbed my Final Touch X10 and we're gonna go measure the temperature right in the pit before we remove it. That way there's not any time advantage for when we remove it to when we check the temperatures. The reason, again, that we're doing this test is to see how much energy is being transferred into our water. If we're running the same 250 degrees ambient air temperature, that means we've got sort of the same hot air passing over our food. That might help with rendering the bark or rendering the fat, developing the bark. But the concern with something like reverse flows, the sort of the fear factor online, or what I've heard many times with grills that I use, like a Kamado style grill, is you've got your food, your deflector plates right under them, which get very hot, and then the fire and a Kamado style grill below that. Now we obviously don't have that in a reverse flow offset, as it still is offset to the side, but the theory is that the baffle plate is transferring a lot more energy. I don't know if that's true. I do know it cooks quicker, so that's a very plausible outcome. So let's, without further ado, go measure the water temperature. We'll grab our food scale and test the evaporative cooling of each of our smokers. Okay, first up is my Huron, which is representing Team Direct Flow. Let's get a temperature of the water here. I'm gonna call that 163 degrees. Okay, next let's check the reverse flow. So this is the Echo. Saw 167 flash, 166. I'm gonna call that pretty stable, 166. Our fire's just starting to die down, but we're still just holding right at the 250 line. Looks like 152. So first up is the reverse flow. Looks like that's 1.42 pounds. Next, the direct flow Huron. We are 1.58 pounds. I know the camera for some reason makes that flicker, but that's a 1.58, 1.59. It's flipping back and forth, 158. And one more. This is the Old Country G2, which is weighing in at 1.68 pounds. I decided last minute to include the Old Country G2, because I have it available, but might as well do the same test at the exact same time, since my observations with it having a fully insulated firebox. Both of these are semi-insulated fire boxes with an air gap, and there's no insulation material. The G2 Old Country goes for not only sort of double-walled steel firebox, but fully insulated. And not that you would do this, but I filled it with charcoal and was able to run 8 hours at usable low and slow temperatures. But to me, it's almost sort of striking that balance of the Kamado of offset smokers, where it's incredibly efficient and only requiring a log and then 2 logs in the next interval at 25-30 minutes, and then back log 2 logs in order to maintain the same temperatures. But I wanted to see, since I have another direct flow available, how the insulation on the firebox as well as the smaller footprint impacts the evaporation in the water test. So the Old Country G2 evaporated the least amount of water, as well as having the coolest temperature. So this would make sense that the water is, again, not being given any heat below. A quick note on that, though, is I did not install the optional heat deflector plate as well as the tuner plate in order to maybe move some of that heat further underneath. So that is a choice that you have if you happen to be looking at the Old Country G2, but I wanted to keep everything for a direct flow to a direct flow as consistent as possible, so I took that out and ran it in normal direct flow operation. So lowest water temperature and least amount of water evaporated. Next, or second most amount of water temperature evaporated was the direct flow Huron by Smoke North, and evaporating the most with the highest water temperature by a couple degrees was the Echo. And I'm definitely expecting something to be different here to explain why things like brisket or ribs are cooking 20-30% quicker. There has to be something, but to understand a little bit more about what that something is, I've got my IR gun as well as my IR camera, and now that these pits are approaching the 5-hour mark at running 250 to 270 degrees, to see if there's any more clues to let us know what's actually going on inside of our smokers. Okay, we're running along at 250. Let's get a outside temperature. Working our way as we get closer to the firebox, sort of, I guess that's where the hot air is coming up right there. We're about 250, and then working down as we get towards our collector, the coldest spot up here on the left, 202. Let's go take a look at the firebox. So this is where you could see the most amount of energy in the infrared camera. Not too much temperature coming through that double walled with the IR gun. So the hottest that I'm getting there is 181 degrees. And on our door, which was showing as white hot, this is where I'm seeing the biggest temperature gradient of nearly 600 degrees Fahrenheit. Our two Smoke North pits look pretty similar on the data. So the opposite of the direct flow, we've got the heat going underneath the baffle, coming at what you can see in the infrared data, sort of that fire running right along the baffle and coming up. So it should be a little bit hotter here on the left side. So 200 degrees on the very top. We're down to 179 degrees because that's where the fire is being drawn into our collector here at great level. So we would get that up and over pattern. On the firebox, it looks like we are running slightly hotter despite being at the same 250 degrees. So on our surface temperature on top of the sort of either log rack and or I use that for simmering sauces, we're 317 degrees. And our firebox is running along at 445 degrees. So this is a 24-inch firebox, where my first generation build Huron G2 had a 28-inch firebox, which was later updated to be the same 24. I think it's running a little bit cooler. So we're a few degrees cooler as I thought looking at the data. So we're 418 degrees on the firebox, 316.4 degrees on top of the flat top. So what did we learn? Well, first thing, kind of obvious here, but all offsets are not created equal. We saw a very big difference between two ideas applied differently, whether it was our smaller Old Country G2 with a heavily insulated firebox versus something like my Huron G2 with a semi-insulated firebox. So first of all, saying a direct flow is created equal, that is where maybe some of this confusion comes from. Speaking of confusion, you know, you have people saying lots of things, promoting their pits, lots of cool designs. This year has saw the introduction of more offset smokers that I've seen in recent memory. You go to Europe, you've got Pitmaster X making one there for the European audience who, like me in my part of the country, shipping and getting things to your backyard can cost more than the pit itself. So there's brand new options in Europe. You've got Jeremy from Mad Scientist has launched the solution offset. Chud's makes and manufactures Chud Box and as well as sold a couple, you know, offsets. And you've got barbecue joints like Goldie's getting into the mix with their innovative design and having a completely different approach to how heat is piped in from the firebox into your offset smoker, and claims in terms of like what is good, whether biscuits are burnt or not burnt.
Two right here in the middle that got pretty hot.
That's looking pretty good.
And see how we did.
That's looking pretty good.
To claims like reverse flow offset smokers will cook your ribs in an hour or two compared to a Texas style direct flow.
It just doesn't work as well as your traditional super convective offset cooker. There's so much radiant heat that everything cooks a lot quicker, and those ribs were done in 2 hours. You're not gonna get much smoke flavor in 2 hours. The bark has a weird texture to it. The edges here got dry and the top got dry. Yeah, that looks like trash. Feathery. Interesting. Yeah, now I'm starting to find that underside where it got toasted. Shreddy, beef jerky-like.
The opinions are endless, but we open this video with, we're gonna try and separate some of the opinions with some facts. So what do the facts tell us? Well, so the reverse flow offset due to the baffle plate, it does put more energy in terms of the water. We are running a couple degrees hotter. It also led the evaporative cooling test in terms of reducing the amount of water in the 4 hours that we had all of our sponges and water baths in the foil pans inside of each of our smokers. And this makes sense to me, where I've done side by side. I did beef ribs in my reverse flow versus my direct flow, and I noticed almost a 30% speed advantage to something like the reverse flow offset smoker. The bark, to me, looked slightly better, perhaps because it was hours longer on the direct flow. And while that was my choice, as soon as I took everything inside, the family's flavor profile picked what I called a slightly milder smoke bark. So if you had to make a decision, I would say that maybe there is a slightly milder smoke flavor and slightly less pronounced bark, which is perhaps just purely due to the fact that there's hours less in the smoke in order to cook something. So that's one data point. The speed is, I think, for me, one of the most practical data points. 30% may not sound like a lot, but if you're trying to cook a brisket same day for dinner, that's the difference between getting up and starting my fire at something like 3 in the morning on my direct offset versus 5 to 6 in the morning on my reverse flow offset. And that for me is a lot more manageable to do more often than the special occasions. And last but not least, looking at the IR camera data, as you would expect, you can see the baffle plate absorbing energy. But I should note, this is a smaller offset, and you'll notice in the data sort of even more usable grid space. I've observed this in many other tests, starting with my first offset, that you get a bit of a hot spot coming out of the firebox as well as the collector. So imagine, if you will, a rainbow pattern of heat. So if we had 350 degrees Fahrenheit coming out of the firebox and 350 degrees using a meat probe or a tracking probe by the collector, you'd end up about 50 degrees cooler in that nice cooking bubble in the middle. A reverse flow offset, what it does is it gives you more of that cooking space. So in a smaller form factor in your backyard, you get more usable real estate in terms of things that you can actually cook. So this is due to go back. I mentioned earlier, I'm borrowing it versus the one that I actually own. And I'm facing a decision to make soon, whether or not I return it and or choose to buy it and potentially sell my own. As where I'd like to go in the future, is I've absolutely fallen in love with the offset category, but everyone has gotten progressively bigger. And in the future, I would love to have maybe something like a trailer rig with an offset that I could take to church, to friends barbecue, to competitions, or anything like that, little pop-up events, and be able to take that with me outside of the backyard. So getting an even larger model with a trailer would be what I would like to do sort of on weekends. And then for the family, the idea of less footprint, 30% faster, and call it splitting hairs of who likes which smoke profile better. Family liked reverse flow, I liked direct flow. That this is so comparable. I think the internet has led us astray here at overlooking the reverse flow category. And I've seen this in comments from people that own Shirley's or other reverse flow smokers, letting me know that they've had one and they absolutely love it. And after 6 months of testing, I couldn't agree more that the reverse flow form factor is something that you shouldn't feel like you need to overlook if you find yourself in the market in 2024 to pick up your very first or maybe a newer offset smoker. If you've got any questions about this video or any others, be sure to check out the Members Live. I go live once a month, and you can ask me a question real time versus these pre-recorded videos. That's it for today. I'm James from Smoke Dad BBQ, getting ready to sign off. And next time you see me, I'll have to have made up my mind whether or not I'm actually going to let this go, or once again, I'll be buying another offset and trying to sell my G2 Huron. See you in the next one. Don't be afraid to fire it up.